Father Michael Collins checked his watch as he walked through the busy airport terminal. He was running a bit late for his flight from Atlanta to San Francisco, where he would be giving a special sermon at his friend's church. The 45-year-old Episcopal priest moved quickly through the crowd, dressed in simple black pants and a blue button-up shirt with his clerical collar. He carried only a small carry-on bag and a worn leather briefcase containing his Bible and sermon notes. Despite his hurry, Father Collins still smiled and nodded at people who made eye contact with him. He had always been taught to be kind, even when in a rush. His mother used to say, "Kindness costs nothing but means everything." It was a lesson he carried with him and shared with his congregation back home. When he finally reached the gate, most passengers had already boarded. The gate agent checked his ticket and smiled. "You're all set, Father. Have a pleasant flight." Father Collins thanked her and walked down the jetway. As he stepped onto the plane, he felt the familiar excitement of travel. Though he flew several times a year for church conferences and family visits, he still enjoyed the feeling of going somewhere new. "Welcome aboard," said a flight attendant at the door, barely looking up from her passenger list. Father Collins nodded politely and made his way down the aisle toward his seat in first class. His father had insisted on booking him a comfortable seat for the 5-hour flight. "You need to rest before your big sermon," his father had said during their last phone call. As he approached the first-class cabin, another flight attendant, whose name tag read Vanessa Mercer, stepped into his path. She looked at him with obvious suspicion. "Excuse me, sir," Vanessa said loudly. "The economy section is toward the back of the aircraft." Father Collins smiled patiently. This wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions about him. "Actually, I'm in first class," he explained, showing her his boarding pass. "Seat 3A. Vanessa glanced at the ticket but didn't move aside. Instead, she frowned and looked him up and down. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice carrying throughout the cabin. "Let me see that again." Several passengers looked up from their seats. Father Collins felt his cheeks grow warm, but he kept his calm expression as he handed over his boarding pass once more. "This must be an error," Vanessa said, examining the ticket with exaggerated care. "Were you perhaps upgraded at the last minute?" "No," Father Collins replied, his voice still steady despite his growing discomfort. "My seat was booked this way from the beginning." A white businessman already seated in first class watched the scene with growing concern. He recognized the situation for what it was, having seen similar incidents before. "He showed you his boarding pass," the businessman called out. "What's the problem?" Vanessa ignored him and turned back to Father Collins. "I'll need to see some identification, please," she said, though she hadn't asked any other passengers for ID after boarding. Father Collins reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed her his driver's license, maintaining his dignity despite the humiliating treatment. "I'm just following protocol," Vanessa said loudly, as if justifying herself to the other passengers. What Vanessa didn't know, what she couldn't have guessed looking at the humble priest standing before her, was that Michael Collins was the youngest son of Robert Collins, the billionaire investor whose firm had recently acquired a controlling stake in this very airline. The Collins family preferred to stay out of the spotlight, and Father Michael had chosen a path of service rather than business. But he was nonetheless a member of one of the wealthiest families in America. As Vanessa finally, reluctantly stepped aside to let him pass, Father Collins had no idea that this uncomfortable moment would soon become much more complicated for everyone involved. Father Collins settled into his first-class seat, placing his briefcase under the seat in front of him. He took a deep breath to calm himself. Though the encounter with Vanessa had been unpleasant, he tried not to dwell on it. Years of facing similar situations had taught him to protect his peace of mind. Vanessa continued giving him sideways glances as she helped other passengers. Her body language made it clear she still believed something was wrong with his presence in first class. When she offered pre-flight drinks to the other passengers, she passed by Father Collins without a word. The businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned across the aisle. "I'm sorry about that," he said, extending his hand. "I'm David Reynolds." "Michael Collins." Father Collins replied with a warm smile, shaking David's hand. "Thank you for your kindness." "Unacceptable behavior," David muttered, glaring in Vanessa's direction. "You should report her." Father Collins shook his head gently. "I try not to add more negativity to the world." What Father Collins didn't mention was his family's connection to the airline. He never used his family name to gain special treatment or to intimidate others. His path as a priest was about humility and service, not power and privilege. As the remaining passengers boarded, David pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. Though Father Collins couldn't see the screen, David was messaging his colleague. "You won't believe who I'm sitting near. Michael Collins, son of Robert Collins. Yes, that Collins family. And the flight attendant is treating him terribly, has no idea who he is." The plane began taxiing, and Father Collins opened his briefcase. He took out his worn Bible and a notebook filled with handwritten notes for his upcoming sermon on dignity and respect. The irony wasn't lost on him. "First time flying with us?" a male flight attendant named Marcus asked as he checked Father Collins' seatbelt. "No, I fly quite regularly," Father Collins replied politely. "Father Collins is a frequent flyer," David added pointedly, loud enough for Vanessa to hear as she passed by. "He deserves the same respect as any other passenger." Vanessa's face flushed, but she said nothing. Once they reached cruising altitude, Vanessa began the first-class meal service. When she reached Father Collins, her manner was stiff and formal. "What would you like to eat, sir?" she asked without making eye contact. "The chicken would be fine, thank you," Father Collins replied kindly. As Vanessa walked away, Father Collins noticed her stopping to chat warmly with other passengers, laughing at their jokes and offering extra drinks without being asked. When she returned with his meal, she practically dropped the tray on his table and moved on without a word. An older woman across the aisle noticed this and frowned. She pressed her call button, and when Vanessa arrived, the woman said loudly, "I'd like to know why you're treating that gentleman differently than the rest of us." Several passengers turned to look. Vanessa's face went pale. "I'm not," she began. "Yes, you are," the woman interrupted, "and it's shameful." Father Collins felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. "Please," he said gently. "It's all right." But David Reynolds had had enough. He called over Marcus, the male flight attendant. "I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant," David said firmly. "This kind of treatment of any passenger is unacceptable, but especially when directed at a man of the cloth." Marcus looked confused but nodded. "I'll get her right away, sir." As Marcus walked toward the front of the plane, Father Collins' phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his father. "How's the flight, son? The new CEO of the airline just called to check if you're comfortable. Apparently, word travels fast. Let me know if everything is okay." Father Collins sighed. He had wanted a quiet trip, but it seemed that was not to be. He put his phone away without responding, wondering how this situation would unfold once the truth about his family came to light. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 50s named Beverly, arrived at the first-class cabin with a concerned expression. Marcus had whispered something to her, and she immediately approached Father Collins' row. "Is there a problem here?" Beverly asked, looking between David Reynolds and Father Collins. Before David could speak, Father Collins raised his hand gently. "There was a small misunderstanding during boarding," he said in a calm voice, "but I'm sure we can all move forward and enjoy the rest of the flight." Beverly studied Father Collins' face, noting his clerical collar and kind eyes. She seemed to understand the situation without needing details. "I apologize if there was any discomfort caused to you, Father," she said sincerely. "Please let me know if there's anything you need during the flight." From the galley, Vanessa watched the exchange with growing anxiety. She had realized her mistake but was too proud to admit it openly. Instead, she busied herself with preparation for the drink service, avoiding eye contact with anyone in first class. As Beverly walked back to the front, she stopped to have a quiet word with Vanessa. Though passengers couldn't hear the conversation, Vanessa's face showed a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. Father Collins returned to his sermon notes, trying to focus on the message of forgiveness he would deliver on Sunday. His phone buzzed again, another text from his father. "Michael, the airline CEO is very concerned. Apparently, several passengers have already emailed customer service about an incident involving you. Should I be worried?" Father Collins texted back, "Everything is fine, Dad. Please don't make a big deal of this. We can talk later." He put his phone away and noticed David watching him curiously. "You seem very calm for someone who was just disrespected," David observed. Father Collins smiled. "Getting upset won't change what happened, but how I respond might change what happens next." A few rows ahead, A passenger was scrolling through social media on her tablet. She stopped suddenly and looked back at Father Collins with wide eyes. She leaned over to her husband and whispered something. He turned to look at Father Collins as well. Father Collins noticed but didn't think much of it until the passenger approached him on her way to the restroom. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Are you Father Michael Collins, from Street Stephens in Atlanta?" Father Collins nodded, a bit surprised. "Yes, I am." "I thought so," she said with a smile. "I attended your guest sermon in Chicago last year. It was beautiful. But also," she lowered her voice even more, "aren't you Robert Collins' son, from Collins Financial Group?" Father Collins felt his heart sink slightly. He preferred being recognized for his work as a priest rather than his family connections. "Yes," he admitted softly, "but I prefer to keep that quiet." The woman nodded understanding. "Of course, it's just... Isn't Collins Financial the company that just bought majority shares in this airline last month?" David Reynolds, who was listening to this exchange, nearly choked on his drink. He stared at Father Collins with new understanding. "Your family owns this airline?" David whispered in disbelief. Father Collins sighed. "My father's company is the majority shareholder now, yes, but I'm not involved in the business side." News of Father Collins' identity spread quickly through the first-class cabin in hushed whispers. Passengers began looking at him with new interest, and at Vanessa with something between pity and satisfaction. Beverly, who had overheard the revelation, rushed to the cockpit to inform the captain. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. When Vanessa emerged from the galley for the next service round, Beverly intercepted her and whispered urgently in her ear. Vanessa's face turned pale as she looked at Father Collins with new eyes, not seeing a black man out of place in first class, but the son of her company's owner, a man who could end her career with a single word. Father Collins watched this transformation with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He had seen it too many times before, people who changed their behavior not because they recognized their prejudice was wrong, but because they discovered he had power they hadn't expected. As Vanessa stood frozen in the aisle, Father Collins wondered what lesson might come from this uncomfortable situation. Vanessa approached Father Collins with a tray of drinks, her hands visibly shaking. Her earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by nervous energy that made her movements stiff and unnatural. "Would you like something to drink, Father Collins?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Water would be fine, thank you," Father Collins replied kindly. As she poured his water with trembling hands, a few drops spilled onto the tray. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, dabbing at the spill with a napkin. "It's just water," Father Collins assured her. "No harm done." Vanessa handed him the glass, then hesitated. It was clear she wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. Instead, she hurried away to serve other passengers. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wilson speaking. We got clear skies ahead and should be arriving in San Francisco on schedule. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for choosing Collins Airways for your travel needs. As some of you may know, our airline recently underwent new ownership, and we're excited about the positive changes ahead." At the mention of Collins Airways, several more passengers turned to look at Father Collins. He kept his eyes fixed on his sermon notes, pretending not to notice. David Reynolds leaned over again. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Will you report her?" Father Collins shook his head. "That's not why I'm here. I'm traveling to give a sermon on forgiveness and human dignity. What kind of example would I be setting if I didn't practice what I preach?" David looked confused. "But she humiliated you in front of everyone." "And how would getting her fired help either of us grow?" Father Collins asked gently. "Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is someone who's shown us their prejudice. But that's exactly when forgiveness matters most." In the galley, Beverly was having an intense conversation with Vanessa. "Do you understand how serious this is?" Beverly whispered urgently. "That's Michael Collins. His father owns the airline now." "I didn't know," Vanessa said, her voice breaking. "How was I supposed to know?" "That's exactly the point," Beverly replied firmly. "You shouldn't treat any passenger that way, regardless of who they are." Vanessa wiped a tear from her cheek. "What should I do? Should I apologize?" "Of course you should apologize," Beverly said. "But more importantly, You need to understand why what you did was wrong in the first place. Back in the cabin, Father Collins was writing additional notes for his sermon, inspired by the day's events. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his sister, Catherine. "Dad told me what's happening on your flight. The CEO is freaking out. Should I call him off?" Father Collins texted back, "Please do. This doesn't need to become a bigger issue than it already is." As he put his phone away, he noticed the woman who had recognized him earlier was now showing her husband something on her tablet. With a sinking feeling, he realized they were looking at a news article about the Collins family's acquisition of the airline. The man whispered something to his wife, who nodded and took a photo of Father Collins with her phone, trying to be discreet but failing completely. Father Collins sighed. This was exactly why he rarely mentioned his family connections. His work as a priest was about serving others and spreading a message of love and acceptance. His family's wealth often complicated that mission, changing how people saw him and treated him. Beverly came by his seat and leaned down. "Father Collins, I want to personally apologize for any discomfort you experienced today. The captain would like to speak with you after we land." "That won't be necessary," Father Collins said. "I'm not looking to cause any trouble." "It's no trouble at all," Beverly insisted. "He's a great admirer of your father's business philosophy and would consider it an honor." Father Collins nodded reluctantly. He knew that refusing would only draw more attention. Meanwhile, Vanessa remained in the galley, occasionally peeking out at him with a mixture of fear and shame in her eyes. As the flight continued, Father Collins noticed how the dynamics had completely shifted. The same passengers who had witnessed his humiliation now watched with interest to see what would happen next. Some seemed to expect him to demand justice. Others appeared amused by Vanessa's reversal of fortune. But Father Collins had different plans. This uncomfortable situation had given him the perfect real-life example for his upcoming sermon on the transformative power of forgiveness. 2 hours into the flight, the tension in the first-class cabin remained thick. Vanessa had been mostly absent, with Beverly and Marcus handling the service instead. From his seat, Father Collins could see Vanessa sitting in the jump seat in the galley, her head in her hands. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have some exciting news. We just received word that Robert Collins himself will be at San Francisco International Airport today for a meeting with airline executives. Some of you may know Mr. Collins as the head of Collins Financial Group, which recently acquired our airline. If we're lucky, we might spot him when we land." Father Collins closed his eyes briefly. His father hadn't mentioned meeting him at the airport. This was a new development, undoubtedly triggered by the texts and calls about the incident. Beverly approached Father Collins with a fresh cup of tea. "The captain just learned about your presence on board, Father Collins. He's honored to have you flying with us today." "Thank you," Father Collins replied. "But I would really prefer to be treated like any other passenger." "Of course," Beverly said, though her special attention contradicted her words. "By the way, your father's assistant called the cockpit. Mr. Collins will be meeting you at the gate personally." Father Collins nodded, trying to hide his frustration. His father had always been protective, even more so since Michael had chosen a path so different from the family business. While his siblings all held executive positions in Collins Financial, Michael had followed his calling to serve God and community. In the galley, a new conversation was taking place. The captain had sent a message for Vanessa to come to the cockpit. As she made her way forward, passengers watched with curious eyes. David Reynolds leaned toward Father Collins again. "I think she's getting what she deserves," he whispered. Father Collins turned to him with a gentle but firm expression. "No one deserves to be humiliated, Mr. Reynolds. Not me, and not her either." David looked surprised. "But after how she treated you—" "We all make mistakes," Father Collins said. "The question is what we learn from them." 10 minutes later, Vanessa returned from the cockpit. Her eyes were red, and she walked with the careful steps of someone trying very hard not to fall apart in public. She stopped by Father Collins' seat, gathering her courage. "Father Collins," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "May I speak with you privately for a moment?" Father Collins nodded and followed her to an empty space near the galley. "I've been instructed to apologize to you," Vanessa said, looking at the floor. "The captain says it's necessary for me to acknowledge my inappropriate behavior." Father Collins studied her face. Is that the only reason you're apologizing? Because you were told to? Vanessa looked up, surprised by the question. For the first time, she really looked at him, not as a black man in first class, not as the son of the owner, but as a human being standing before her. No, she admitted after a moment. I'm apologizing because I was wrong. I made assumptions about you based on. I judged you without knowing anything about you. If I had treated you with basic respect from the beginning, none of this would have happened. Father Collins nodded. Thank you for your honesty. Will you? Vanessa hesitated. Will you tell your father to fire me? Is that what you're worried about? Father Collins asked gently. Of course I am, Vanessa replied. Your family owns the airline now. One word from you and I'll lose everything. Father Collins shook his head. I have no intention of asking for any action against you. That's not who I am or what I believe in. Relief washed over Vanessa's face, followed quickly by confusion. Why? I don't understand. Because punishment rarely leads to growth, Father Collins explained. True change comes from understanding, not fear. As they returned to the cabin, the plane began its initial descent into San Francisco. Passengers fastened their seatbelts and put away their belongings. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. The tension had eased slightly, replaced by thoughtful silence. Father Collins looked out the window at the approaching city, thinking about the upcoming meeting with his father. Robert Collins was a brilliant businessman but not always a patient man. Convincing him to see this incident as an opportunity rather than a problem would be Father Collins' next challenge. The plane touched down on the runway at San Francisco International Airport, and Father Collins felt the familiar bump as the wheels made contact with the ground. As they taxied to the gate, he could see a small group of people waiting near the terminal windows. Even from a distance, he recognized his father's tall figure and commanding presence. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco, the captain announced. The local time is 2:15 p.m., and the weather is a pleasant 68 degrees. We ask that you remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. And if I may add a personal note, it has been our honor to have Father Michael Collins, son of our new owner Robert Collins, on board with us today. Father Collins closed his eyes briefly as a murmur spread through the cabin. The announcement had eliminated any lingering doubts about his identity. When he opened his eyes, he saw Vanessa standing in the aisle, her face pale as she glanced toward the waiting group at the gate. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding, and passengers began to gather their belongings. David Reynolds stood up quickly. It was a pleasure meeting you, Father Collins, he said, extending his hand. Your father is a brilliant businessman. My firm has followed his career for years. Thank you, Father Collins replied politely. Safe travels. As other passengers prepared to deplane, many stopped to introduce themselves or offer comments about his father's business achievements. Father Collins responded to each with patience, though he was eager to exit the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Beverly approached as the line began to move. Father Collins, the captain has requested that you wait until other passengers have deplaned. Your father has arranged for you to exit first, through the front door. Father Collins shook his head. That won't be necessary. I'll exit with everyone else, thank you. But sir, your father. My father will understand, Father Collins said firmly. As he waited his turn in the aisle, Father Collins noticed Vanessa standing rigidly by the exit door. When he approached, she couldn't meet his eyes. Thank you for the flight, he said kindly. Father Collins, she said in a low voice. There are executives waiting at the gate. They know about what happened. I recognized the airline president with your father. Father Collins paused. What are you afraid will happen? I'll be fired on the spot, she whispered. This job is all I have. My mother is sick, and my health insurance covers her treatments. Father Collins hadn't known this personal detail, and it added a new dimension to the situation. Sometimes forgiveness wasn't just about feelings. It had practical implications for people's lives. Stay here, he told her. I'll speak with them first. As Father Collins stepped off the plane, his father immediately moved forward to greet him, accompanied by 3 men in business suits. Robert Collins was in his 60s, with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone used to being in charge. Michael, his father said, embracing him briefly. When I heard about what happened, I came straight from my meeting. Dad, it wasn't necessary. It absolutely was, his father interrupted. No one treats my son that way, especially not an employee of my airline. One of the men stepped forward. Father Collins, I'm Jason Parker, president of Collins Airways. I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable behavior of our flight attendant. She will be terminated immediately. Father Collins raised his hand. Mr. Parker, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want anyone fired over this incident. His father looked surprised. Michael, this woman humiliated you in front of other passengers. There have to be consequences. There are always consequences, Dad, Father Collins agreed. But they don't have to be punitive. This could be an opportunity instead. An opportunity? His father looked confused. For growth and learning, Father Collins explained. Not just for one flight attendant, but for the entire airline. The airline executives exchanged uncertain glances. Passengers exiting the plane slowed down to listen, creating a growing audience for this unexpected conversation. What exactly are you suggesting, son? Robert Collins asked, studying his son's face. Father Collins took a deep breath. I have an idea that might turn this unfortunate incident into something positive for everyone involved. Father Collins led his father and the airline executives to a quiet corner of the gate area. Passengers from the flight watched with interest as they passed, some even stopping to hear what might happen next. Dad, Father Collins began, what if instead of firing Vanessa, we use this situation to create real change in how the airline trains its staff? Robert Collins crossed his arms, his expression doubtful. I'm listening. Prejudice doesn't disappear when we punish one person, Father Collins explained. It takes education, awareness, and a genuine commitment to doing better. He turned to Jason Parker. Does the airline currently have any diversity training programs? The airline president shifted uncomfortably. We have the standard industry training, but nothing particularly comprehensive. Then this is your opportunity to lead the industry, Father Collins said. To create something meaningful that could benefit not just your employees, but also your passengers. One of the other executives, a woman who had been introduced as the head of human resources, leaned forward with interest. What exactly are you proposing, Father Collins? A new training program focused on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias, Father Collins replied. One that uses real situations, like what happened today, to help staff understand how their actions affect others. And the flight attendant who insulted you? Robert Collins asked, still not convinced. She just gets away with it? Not at all, Father Collins said. I suggest she becomes part of the solution. Have her work with your training team to develop the program. Let her share what she learned from this experience. At that moment, Vanessa emerged from the jetway, her head down as she tried to slip past the group unnoticed. Father Collins called out to her. Vanessa, could you join us for a moment? She froze, then slowly walked toward them, visibly trembling. Yes, Father Collins. These gentlemen are Mr. Parker, the airline president, and my father, Robert Collins, Father Collins said gently. We're discussing a new direction for the airline's staff training. Vanessa swallowed hard, clearly expecting to be fired on the spot. I understand, sir. Robert Collins studied her with a stern expression. My son seems to think you deserve a second chance. I'm not convinced. I don't deserve one, Vanessa said, surprising everyone with her honesty. What I did was wrong. I made assumptions based on how Father Collins looked, not who he was. I've done it before, too, with other passengers. I never had to face it this directly. Her candor seemed to soften Robert Collins' expression slightly. What would you do differently, if given the chance? The HR director asked. Vanessa thought for a moment. Everything. But mostly, I remember that my job isn't to judge who belongs where. It's to make everyone feel welcome, regardless of what they look like or what they're wearing. Father Collins nodded encouragingly. That's exactly the kind of awareness that could help others learn. Jason Parker looked thoughtful. A comprehensive bias training program could actually be good for business. Passengers would feel more welcome. Staff would be better equipped to handle diverse situations. And it would set Collins Airways apart as a leader in the industry, Father Collins added. Instead of a scandal about discrimination, you'd have a story about positive change. Robert Collins' expression gradually changed from skepticism to consideration. He had built his business empire by recognizing good opportunity. 6 months later, Father Collins stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the San Francisco Hilton. Before him sat over 300 Collins Airways employees, from flight attendants to pilots to ground crew. At the front table, his father watched with unmistakable pride. "When I boarded that flight 6 months ago," Father Collins began, "I had no idea it would lead to this moment. I was simply a priest on his way to give a sermon." He smiled. As it turns out, God had a different sermon in mind. The audience laughed softly. Many had heard the story of what happened that day, which had become something of a legend within the company. Today, Collins Airways launches the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in the airline industry. Father Collins continued, "Not because of who my father is, but because one brave woman was willing to acknowledge her mistake and work to make things better." He gestured to the side of the stage, where Vanessa stood waiting. She looked very different now, confident, composed, and proud. In the past 6 months, she had worked tirelessly with the HR team, sharing her experience and helping develop training materials that were honest and effective. "I'd like to invite Vanessa Mercer to join me," Father Collins said, "the real hero of this story." As Vanessa walked toward the podium, the room filled with applause. Some people even stood, including Robert Collins himself. "Thank you, Father Collins," Vanessa said as she reached the microphone. "6 months ago, I made the worst mistake of my career. I judged a man based solely on his appearance, and I was completely wrong." She paused, looking out at her colleagues. "I expected to be fired. Instead, I was given the chance to learn and to help others learn too." She turned to Father Collins. "Your forgiveness changed my life. It would have been easier for you to demand punishment. Instead, you saw an opportunity for growth." Vanessa faced the audience again. "The training program we're launching today isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about recognizing the biases we all carry and learning to see beyond them. It's about treating every passenger, every person, with dignity and respect." In the front row, Jason Parker nodded approvingly. Under his leadership, the airline had fully embraced the new direction. Early results showed improved passenger satisfaction scores and a noticeable decrease in complaints. After the presentation, during the reception, Father Collins found himself standing next to his father by the refreshment table. "You know," Robert Collins said, sipping his coffee, "when I bought this airline, I was thinking about profits and market share. I never imagined it would become a leader in something like this." Father Collins smiled. "Sometimes our best contributions to the world aren't the ones we plan." Across the room, Vanessa was speaking with a group of new flight attendants, her hands moving expressively as she shared her experience. Several times, she pointed toward Father Collins with clear respect in her gesture. "She's really transformed," Robert observed. "From nearly being fired to becoming one of our most valuable trainers." "People can surprise us when we give them the chance," Father Collins replied. As the event wound down, Vanessa approached Father Collins one last time. "I'm flying to Atlanta next week to conduct training at your home base," she said. "I never thought I'd say this, but that difficult day changed everything for me. I see people differently now, really see them." "That's all any of us can hope for," Father Collins said, "to grow a little each day, to see each other more clearly." Later, as Father Collins and his father walked out of the hotel, Robert put his arm around his son's shoulders. "You know, Michael, I've built buildings, acquired companies, and made billions of dollars. But watching you turn that ugly incident into something that's helping thousands of people, that might be the achievement I'm most proud to be associated with." Father Collins smiled. "It wasn't just me, Dad. It took Vanessa's courage, your willingness to listen, and the airline's commitment to change. One person alone couldn't have done it." As they reached the waiting car, Father Collins looked back at the hotel where airline employees were still mingling, sharing ideas and experiences. "That's the real miracle," he said softly. "Not that one person can make a difference, but that when we work together, even our worst moments can become the foundation for something beautiful." Robert Collins nodded thoughtfully. "Now that," he said with a smile, "sounds like a sermon worth hearing." "It is," Father Collins agreed. "And the wonderful thing is, it's being preached not just in words, but in actions, every day, on every flight."